Welcome, everyone. Good evening. This is the EEOST Capital Fund information session. And thank you all for taking the time to participate in this information session. My name is Teresa Jordan, and I am the director of the Children's Investment Fund. But before we get started, we just wanted to go through a few logistics. All of you are on mute, and that's because we will be using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for any questions. The chat function has been disabled as well. So if you have questions, if you could please, excuse me, submit your questions through the Q&A. We will have some time at the end of the session for a live Q&A session, but we will also be able to answer any questions that you have as we move throughout the webinar. And the webinar will be recorded. We will share all of the slides with those that have registered for the webinar, and that will be posted on the Combis website, which is where you found the application documents. And then lastly, we noticed that there were a number of family child care providers that had registered for this session. And unfortunately, the EEOST funding is only the only eligible folks to apply for this funding are nonprofit child care centers. So we apologize for that if that was not clear, but family child care providers are not eligible to apply for this funding. Okay, next slide, please. So we had two information sessions. The first one was on Tuesday at 11 a.m. and this is the second one. And the purpose of the information sessions are to go through the application process and the grant conditions, to talk about any changes in the fiscal year 23 round compared to the fiscal 22 round, and then also to describe the timeline, and then of course the question and answer session. And we want to again just make sure that we're able to answer all of your questions, and we do have an email address that you can submit your questions to, and we'll show you that on the last slide. So presenting with me today are Neil Flynn, who is the Deputy General Counsel at EEC, and Bree Horwitz, who is the Senior Project Manager for the Children's Investment Fund. And I'll now turn it over to Neil.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for participating tonight. With these first few slides, I'd like to provide an overview of the EEOST program. The Early Education and Out of School Time EEOST Capital Fund was created by statute in 2013, specifically an act financing the production and preservation of housing for low and moderate income residents. The statute was reauthorized again in 2018. The EEOST Capital Fund provides grants to tax-exempt nonprofit corporations or organizations in which a nonprofit corporation has a controlling interest. The grant funds shall be used to develop and/or rehabilitate eligible facilities in which at least 50% of the child care slots in the facility shall serve low-income families who are eligible for public subsidy. This year, this round, fiscal year 23, $6.2 million in grant funding has been allocated for the EEOST program. Next slide, please. EEC has designated CDAC, the Community Economic Development Assistance Corporation, to administer the EEOST program. CIF, the Children's Investment Fund, which is affiliated with CDAC, provides technical assistance and financing to early childhood education and out-of-school time facilities across the state. CDAC and CIF has worked with EEC in development of grant review standards and will continue to administer the grants that EEC awards. Since the first round, fiscal year 14, fiscal year 2015, the state has invested $43 million in 90 projects throughout the state. For the past two rounds, fiscal year 21 and fiscal year 22, EEC and CIF modify the EEOST Capital Fund in order to respond to the needs of early childhood education and out-of-school time providers during the COVID-19 pandemic. This year's round, fiscal year 23, will be similar to the modified rounds of the previous 2 years. Next slide, please. Thank you. In these next two slides, I'd like to talk a little bit about eligible facilities as it's defined in our regulations and guidelines. As defined in the regulations, an eligible facility is a building or structure that is or will be owned or leased by one or more eligible organizations and licensed by EEC, provided that A, at least 50% of the slots in the facility shall serve low-income families, as previously mentioned. B, a leased facility shall be leased from a bona fide third party, meaning not from an entity affiliated in any way with the eligible organization, and shall have a lease term that is consistent with the scale of the capital investment, but not to be less than 5 years from the date of completion of the eligible project. C, the facility shall meet all the requirements of 606 CMR 15.03. As outlined in the guidelines, eligible facilities include sites that comply with state statute, specifically Mass General Laws, Chapter 15D, and all regulations and policies adopted thereunder. Eligible facilities must also comply with all applicable federal, state, and local statutes, regulations, and ordinances, including such acts as the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, and the Massachusetts State Building Code, the SBC. Also, again, the childcare slots in an eligible facility must serve at least 50% low-income, serve at least 50% low-income families as of the date of the EEOST application. Next slide, please. A few more things regarding eligible facilities that are outlined in our guidelines. If a building, structure, or site is leased, then the leased facility shall have a lease term that is consistent with the scale of the capital investment, but again, shall not be less than 5 years. If a building, structure, or site is or will be municipally owned that dedicates a single purpose space for licensed early education and out-of-school time programs, then the lease must be for not less than 5 years also. Next slide, please. Thank you. Just a few words on partnerships. A for-profit may act in a joint venture with a nonprofit developer. However, the nonprofit developer or partner is required to have at least a 51% controlling interest in the joint venture, a controlling interest meaning a managerial or financial interest. Organizational documents of the for-profit must be provided along with a description of the nonprofit's controlling interest and the nonprofit's organizational documents. None of the members of the partnership, either for-profit or nonprofit, can benefit in any way from the EEOST funding. Next slide, please. The grant agreement will include language regarding a land use obligation. This obligation ensures that the continued use of the property for large group and school-age childcare for a specific term, that specific term being 5 years. The obligation may be released under certain conditions, 4 of which are included here below on the slide, upon completion of the grant term, if a project were to be foreclosed on by a mortgage holder of a bona fide first mortgage, with EEC's consent, or in the event of a grant recapture. Next slide, please. And before I turn the presentation back over to Teresa, just a few words on recapture. If the eligible project or facility is found to be in non-compliance with any EEC regulation or policy, the terms and provisions of the EEOST grant documents, or with any other applicable federal, state, or local law, regulation, or ordinance, the grantee will have 90 days to rectify those matters in a manner that's acceptable to EEC prior to any recapture of the grant funds. Compliance will be determined at the sole discretion of EEC. If for any reason the grantee fails to comply with the terms and provisions of the grant agreement, CDAC, CIF, or EEC will recapture the grant funds, and the funds will be recaptured according to a schedule that is detailed in our EEOST guidelines. Next slide, please. And as you can see, this slide here just basically details the recapture schedule that can be found in the guidelines. If the event of default occurs on a date that is on or before a certain anniversary of the project completion deadline, then a certain percentage of the grant proceeds shall be recaptured and repaid to the grantor. For example, bullet point 2 states if the event of default occurs on a date that is after the first anniversary, but on or before the second anniversary of the project completion deadline, then 80% of the grant proceeds shall be recaptured in that situation. And as the slide further specifies, the percentage of recapture decreases as time elapses. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn the presentation back over to Teresa at this point. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Neil.
Of course.
So on this slide, what we're showing are the similarities and the changes that were made compared to fiscal 22. So what you see here is that in the first bullet, the organizations whose projects are 100% complete at the time of the application cannot apply for EEOST funding for reimbursement. We are most interested in projects that are in the earlier stages of construction and not projects that are fully complete. And that's because we would like to provide technical assistance that might be needed to help to create a high quality project. And then also we will continue to focus on projects that address health and safety issues, emergency repairs, and accessibility modifications. So in terms of the major changes this year compared to last year, due to what we're seeing as, construction cost increases based on supply chain issues and not being able to access the materials that are needed to do this work, we have decided to increase the amount of funding. Last year, the grants, the range was between $100,000 and $250,000. We have increased that to between $200,000 and $500,000. Again, that's because we're seeing that the projects that we funded in last year are coming in with construction costs that are much higher than the $250,000 grant that we awarded. And we are really, trying hard not to have projects that are unable to move forward because they can't finance that gap in funding. And then the last bullet here is based on the traditional round of EEOST. So the traditional round is when we were providing grants up to $1 million. That happened between fiscal 14 and fiscal 20. And what we're stating here is that if you received a $1 million grant, or some of the grants were a little less than $1 million, then you would be eligible to apply. If it's the same site that you're looking at, you would be eligible to apply for this funding, provided that you did not receive a grant in fiscal 21 or in fiscal 22 for the same site. Next slide, please. Okay, so EEOST can be used to pay for the entire cost of your project. Again, our range is between $200,000 and $500,000. Your request has to be at least $200,000. The request can exceed $500,000, but you need to show evidence of the other source of funds that will pay costs above $500,000. And those costs must be in place by December 8th, which is the application deadline. And again, you can't submit an application for reimbursement on a project that is 100% complete. However, if only a portion of your project has been completed and you have other work to do, there's other work that is a part of the scope of work that you have, then you can apply for funding. But what you would need to do is to submit copies of invoices and other details, letting us, explaining the work that was done, and then letting us know about the work that is needed to be completed. Okay, next slide, please. So project readiness is one of the key requirements to being competitive, and Bree will talk through our scoring system. There are other categories as well, but readiness is one of the key ones. Readiness is determined by your ability to close on the full financial financing and to start construction by December 31st of 2023. So that's next year. Again, any funding needed above $500,000 must be in place by December 8th. And if your project is complicated, meaning if it involves construction, then you need to have already hired professionals such as an architect or a construction project manager or an HVAC consultant in order to be competitive. And Bria will talk more about the cost estimates and professional consultants that are needed based on the type of project that you're applying for. Next slide, please. So in terms of eligible uses, we have pointed out 5 areas where you can apply for funding. The first is that the funds can be used to address improvements to outdoor play spaces. So if you were planning to install resilient surfacing or replace old equipment, that's an eligible use. If you're planning to improve your heating, air conditioning, and heating system, or replace windows that might be old or inoperable, that's another use as well. And then you could also use the funds to reconfigure indoor spaces in terms of classrooms or gross motor space that may not be, you may have space in your building that is not actually being used. And the plan is to make that licensable space by creating a gross motor room or an additional classroom. In terms of emergency repairs, those are tied to replacing your roof or replacing exit signs, addressing plumbing issues, or electrical upgrades. The one thing I'll note here is that the information technology upgrades or any purchases of computers or other equipment related to technology are not eligible for funding. And then lastly, the physical environment modifications include, adding an adding a mobility ramp, replacing door handles and fixtures, or making elevator upgrades. Next slide, please. So we organized the uses of the grant into 5 categories, and I just went through those top 5. This list appears as an Appendix A of the application, and it's not an exhaustive list. These things that we're listing here under each category are actually based on applications that we have seen requests on for fiscal 21 and fiscal 22. Again, it's capital improvements to outdoor play spaces, improvements to air quality, reconfiguration of indoor spaces. Next slide, please. Emergency repairs and physical environment modifications. I will point out that the one thing that the funds cannot be used for are to acquire buildings or to acquire land. So it can't be used for acquisition of property. Next slide, please. So eligible applicants, Neil mentioned that the eligibility criteria is that you have to be a licensed program in good standing with EEC, that you need to be a Chapter 180 nonprofit organization that is tax exempt, and that no one on your board or your staff can financially benefit from this project through the EEOST funding. And then the last thing I'll point out here is that it's really important to note that organizations can apply for only one of their sites, only one application per organization. Again, it can be the same site that you applied for prior to fiscal 20, but it cannot be the same site if you received a grant in fiscal 21 or in fiscal 22. If you applied in fiscal 21 or fiscal 22 and you were not awarded funding, you can reapply. Okay. Next slide, please. And then in terms of the grant timetable, so once the legal closing process for the grant happens, then the EEOST funds will be dispersed. We disperse on a reimbursement basis only for any expenses that were incurred after January 1st of 2022. So if you hired your architect in the summer to get started on redesigning that classroom that was not being used for preschool class as a preschool classroom, and they've been doing work and you've been paying fees to the architect, those fees can be included in your project costs, and those fees would be reimbursed to you once we close on the project if you are funded. So in terms of legal closing costs, all the grantees will be responsible for the EEOST attorney attorney's legal expenses and for your own legal expenses. So we do note here that it's typically ranging around between $5,000 and $6,000, maybe a little less than that. And it would be $6,000 for our attorney and $6,000 for your attorney. That, again, the good news here is that you can include that in your project budget. If, as we're seeing, the costs are coming in to close these projects at less than $6,000, that funding, that, if you closed, your attorney and our attorney both, went through the closing and they spent $4,500, that $1,500 or $3,000 in that case can be used for any project related expenses. So it goes back into the project. So you would not lose that, the remaining balance of the grant. And again, projects must start construction by December 31st of 2023. One other thing in terms of any projects that are construction related, which all of these are, grantees will be required to hire a construction project manager to monitor the construction on your behalf. In terms of the construction project manager for the EEOST program, you would not be responsible for those expenses. They actually are being paid through the EEOST program. So that is not an expense that you would be responsible for. And at this point, I will turn it over to Bree. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Good evening, everyone. This year's EEOST round will consider a range of projects entailing construction in one or more of the 5 major categories that Teresa described. Applicants will need to assemble a team of qualified professionals to plan and implement the work proposed in the application by December 31st, 2023. Whom your organization will hire will vary based on the complexity and nature of your project. If you are expanding or reconfiguring your building, your project team may include architects, general contractors, an owner's construction manager, and/or structural engineers. If you are doing major site work in a playground or outdoor area, your project may necessitate hiring a playground designer, civil engineer, surveyors, and landscape architects. Projects that entail the replacement of heating, ventilation, and conditioning systems, HVAC systems, may necessitate that you retain a mechanical engineer to assess the current conditions and recommend changes to the systems within your buildings. A project that entails minor construction, might be a discrete project like replacing a roof or windows, may require you to retain a general or specialized contractors without needing to retain an architect. Either way, all the contractors and professionals you hire need to be licensed in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for that particular trade and carry appropriate insurance. All applications, to be competitive, must include recent estimates or invoices from qualified parties for work that's already complete. And to be awarded EEOST and requisition the grant funds, the projects will need to have a contract with all of the professionals on board who have completed proper diligence, including obtaining permits and going through the proper channels to approve the project within your city or town. You do not need to have formally retained your general contractors at the time of the application, but you will need to have been working with your design and engineering teams to provide the materials within the application in order to provide a competitive application. The application can include multiple construction scope items or projects at your site, as long as it is all at the same address with the same license. So you may be able to propose doing bathroom renovations, a new handicapped accessibility ramp, and a roof, for example. Internal employees and board members can advise on the project, but as Teresa mentioned, they cannot be, they cannot be paid for the work that they complete. If you have an internal employee who's qualified to to oversee the work, manage the work like a facilities manager who's experienced in construction projects, that is fine. That person can be your owner's project manager. But again, if you rely on the labor or talent of board members or others affiliated with your organization, they must be pro bono. Next slide, please. So please reference the procurement information on combis that Teresa and Neil described to determine whether your project meets the criteria to apply. There's a checklist that includes the documentation that you will submit within the application, including the scope of work, the costs, the timeline. Please ensure that all the requested documentation is included in your application submission. If you are missing checklist items, your application may be considered incomplete and disqualified for future review. If specific answers or aspects within the application or the checklist are not applicable to your particular project, just indicate that within the checklist and within the application. All applications must be submitted to EEC by Thursday, December 8th at 4 p.m. and submitted via email. EEC will complete their preliminary review to determine that each application regards an eligible facility that has a license in good standing and that each organization is in good financial standing with EEC. And then all eligible applications will be forwarded to the Children's Investment Fund for review and evaluation. Next slide, please. So the application is largely a narrative of the problems you are trying to address through the scope that you propose. There is no limit to the word count, so please use all the space you need to describe the issues at hand and the work that you are proposing to complete. Please answer all questions as completely as possible. Again, please review the checklist. The questions that you have regarding the application process can be submitted to EEC via email after today's session. Please submit your questions by November 3rd at 4 p.m. And at the end of this presentation, we'll discuss how you can submit those questions. The questions from the information sessions, both information sessions, will be posted on Combis with the answers on or around November 15th. You'll email the application to EEC at this address, and EEC will send an automated confirmation for each of the emailed applications it receives. This doesn't indicate that your application is complete, just that it was received and processed by EEC. Please CC yourself on the application submission email as well, in case there are issues with your submittal. Many of the checklist items and attachments are large documents, so please look into using a compression service like WinZip or Zip File, both of which are free, to ensure that all the documents can be submitted in one email to EEC. If you are having issues fitting it all into one email, you can send a couple of emails, but please label them clearly with your organization and email them email 1 of 2, 2 of 2. Applications received after the deadline will not be considered. Now this year, we will have virtual site visits with all applicants, which are meetings that will be 50 minutes and an opportunity for the EEOST review team to ask your team questions to clarify the application. You will be asked to bring members of your project team that include the internal professionals within your organization and the external consultants that you have hired to work on the project. You want to ensure that you have a team assembled that can answer questions regarding the scope, the costs, the timeline of your project, questions about your building's layout and maintenance, how you will be handling project and construction management throughout the project, questions about your childcare programs, specifics regarding aspects of the project like design or engineering, as well as management of your organization, including your financials. The state EEOST review team includes architects who are specialized in childcare environments, who will review projects that entail design modifications, major construction or reconfiguration of the spaces within your center, accessibility, and other code review. There will be a team of mechanical engineers to review all projects that entail HVAC, equipment and materials and systems, and construction advisors who will review all projects and ask questions of the construction-related documents within the applications. Your team can share information at the site visit for clarification purposes, including updates to your budget. If your project has passed any milestones since the time of the application, you can provide that information. But unfortunately, we cannot accept documentation that's submitted at the site visit or afterwards. Although everything you share with us at the time of the site visit will be considered in scoring the document. I'm sorry, scoring the project. Next slide, please. So the scoring is based on a 100-point scale, and each project will be scored independently based on these categories. One of the largest aspects of the project scoring, which Teresa mentioned, is the accurate presentation and documentation of the project costs, which is 30% of the score. So this is how well the application documents your proposed project and describes how it meets some or all of the priority categories for this year's EEOST. Projects will be scored on how accurately they have provided supporting documentation about the project, including photos of the problem areas, documentation of the project scope and costs, including recent estimates prepared by qualified professionals, invoices for work already completed, including the company name and the date of the estimate, a complete development budget for all of the expenses within the project, including the expenses relating to the construction cost, including breaking out labor, materials, and a sources and uses budget that indicates the non-construction soft costs, like the legal costs, engineering, design costs, and also documents what other sources are funding the project if the cost of your project exceeds your EEOST request. If it's for projects that entail construction, we are going to look for the submission of plans that document the work to be completed. So that includes architectural plans, site plans of outdoor areas, mechanical engineering and plumbing plans for projects that entail systems. These plans can be schematic or at a design development stage. We don't necessarily need construction level drawings at the time of the application, but whatever you have should be a visual representation that will allow our review team to fully understand the scope of your project and how it impacts the systems within your building. If you are doing major construction, we also need to see that you've included the appropriate documentation. So whether you've done the diligence to complete the work safely, including environmental reports. If it's an outdoor project with land that will be disturbed, we will need an environmental phase 1 site assessment. And if you're doing interior work, hazardous materials reports to assess the presence of lead or asbestos. And if you have not yet completed those reports or commissioned those reports but plan to do so, you can indicate that within the application. But it's helpful to know what hazardous materials are within the areas that you are going to impact as part of this project, and to have the costs and the timeline for remediation incorporated into your budgets. Other key score areas include readiness and feasibility, which is also 30% of the score. So that's whether the applicant has the appropriate resources in place to carry out the work. So that can mean, did you retain the appropriate project team of professionals, the appropriate professionals with the proper qualifications to complete the work? Can the project move forward to meet its pre-closing conditions to start the construction work by the end of calendar year 2023? If the project interferes with daily operations, like an HVAC project may necessitate relocating the program, we want to ensure that you've described that within the application, as well as factoring in timeline issues like winter conditions. If your project costs exceed your EEOST request, we would like to see evidence that you already have other sources identified to go into the project and that these sources are already committed and available and documented within the application. So again, those other sources could be a loan, a line of credit, the organization's internal equity, or fundraising. The next category is financial stability, which is 10 points. We understand that COVID and challenges with staffing are still very much impacting programs, so applicants will not be penalized for operating at a reduced capacity. The application checklist requests historic financial information, like a prior audit, board-approved operating budgets, the current year's balance sheet and profit and loss statements, and the review team will review the financials to determine the organization's performance over the prior year. If your organization has a deficit, we want to understand the factors that led to that deficit and how your organization will change its operations to address that within the coming year. We also want to review 3 years of management letters to the board, which are within the audit. If they indicate significant issues like material deficiencies, we want to understand how your organization addressed those through changes to the operations to remedy the issues. And that would be a conversation we would have at the site visit, for example. The next slide, please. So the preferences are 30 points, and they are 5 points each for 6 areas that relate to your organization, where you're located, and whom you serve. So the preference points are given to projects that are in different parts of the state, including Central Massachusetts and Cape Cod and the islands, facilities where the number of childcare slots serving families receiving public subsidy exceeds the 50% and actually exceeds 80% of the total childcare slots. Programs that serve one or more of EEC's priority populations, which are listed here, whether the project addresses accessibility for issues for individuals with special needs, whether it's located within a gateway city, which is one of 26 cities and towns across Massachusetts. And finally, if the project team includes solicitation of contractors or businesses that are listed on the State Supplier Diversity Office, the XDO. So those include contractors and businesses that are MBEs, minority business enterprises, or WBEs, women-owned business enterprises. Next slide, please. This is a listing of the timeline, which we have gone over in this conversation. Essentially, the deadline for the application is the 8th. We will have those Zoom site visits in January. The review period extends through March, and the target date for announcements is June. So between the time that you have the site visit with us, the Zoom conversation, and when the announcements are made, you will not hear about your project from the review team. And then following that, the projects that receive a conditional commitment of funds in June will work with a project manager on the EEOST side to move through the conditions, the project-specific and general conditions, meet the closing requirements, and start construction by December 31st, 2023. It can be before that point, but that is the deadline. Next slide, please. So what follows are examples from the application spreadsheets. There are a series of 3 worksheets in a document that contain the development budget, the sources and uses budget, and your enrollment data. So these Excel spreadsheets auto populate the pink areas on here. They auto calculate, and you will attach these with your application. So this is an example of the development budget. It's just the first part of the page. That is where you document your project costs in each of the 5 major areas within the application. The next page, please, next slide, are the sources and uses for the project. So this is where you document not only the total construction costs, but also your soft costs or the additional costs for the project, like the fees to pay professionals. That's captured here in the budget, as well as the legal cost for the state's attorney, as Teresa described. If your project cost exceeds your EEOST request, on the sources side is where you would indicate whether you have a loan or internal funds that would pay for the remainder of the project. Next slide. This is a chart that shows your total license capacity and the percentage of slots that are private pay, that are partially subsidized through a scholarship or other means through your organization, and the slots that are supported through subsidies. I'm going to turn it over to Neil to describe the additional subsidies beyond vouchers that will be factored into the affordability calculation within your application.
Thank you, Bree. As you can see in Appendix D, it shows a chart that you would only fill out if your enrollment as of the date of the application indicates subsidy slots representing less than 50% of the total enrollment. So you would fill out this chart for children in your program who receive other public subsidies as of the date of your application, but are not currently in any EEC or Head Start subsidized slot. There are examples of other public subsidies listed here in Appendix D. Some subsidies that are eligible include SSI, SSDI, WIC, SNAP. You must have documentation for families receiving other public subsidies on file each year for the term of the grant if you are awarded funds. Next slide, please.
Great. And so any questions that you have regarding the project related aspects of your project, the real estate development aspects of your project, you can email the Children's Investment Fund at this address. So those questions cannot be about the EEOST application itself or the EEOST program's requirements. For those questions, please email EEC at this address here. And with that, I think we will transition to the Q&A.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Kira Wilkie with the Children's Investment Fund team, and I'll be helping moderate the Q&A portion. Thanks for your questions. Please continue to put questions in. We have about 15 minutes, and so we'll try to get to them. And as Bree said, it will all be sent out to you in a written document and posted on Combis in mid-November, just so you can read through all the questions that came up tonight and on Tuesday's info session and were emailed to us. We'll start with one question. Teresa, if an organization does not have audited financial statements, are they eligible to apply?
So if they do not have audited financials, they are not eligible to apply. The audited financial statements are a requirement of the program that allows us to look at the financials of an organization over a period of time. So we're looking at the income and expenses and whether they're running a deficit, just where the funding comes from and what the funding, the income that's being generated, and then how that income is being used in terms of the expenses that they need to pay. So it is a requirement of the program.
Great. This question is for Bree. If the project requires additional funding, can that funding be committed but not yet received? For example, if we have an additional reimbursement grant for which we can only access the funds once costs are paid for.
Yeah, so I think in the application, you should describe the particulars of that funding source and include the commitment letter. So we just want to ensure that if you are awarded EEOST, that you will have the resources in hand within that time period following the grant award to close on the EEOST grant and start construction. So if it's already committed, you can explain that within the application. If you have funding that is available well after the time the construction is complete, you would need to document some source of funding that could bridge the time until those funds are in hand. For example, if you had a fundraising effort and had pledges that were going to be paid out over several years, you had the commitment, but the pledge money wouldn't be available, you would need to find a source that could have that funding available at the time that you are ready to start construction that could potentially be repaid over time through those payments, those future pledge payments.
All right, another question for you, Bree. If we have an outdoor project, do we need to have an environmental assessment already done for the application?
So the issue with outdoor projects is that if you really need to be able to understand the factors at play that may add costs and complications to your project. So if you have a playground project, for example, that requires site engineering, you have flood issues, parts of your existing play structures are sinking. Ideally, you will have already done site engineering work and consulted with professionals before the application. In terms of environmental and hazardous materials surveys, you can describe your plan to get that work done within the application, but ideally, you want to ensure that there's no big factors that you would have to address. So ideally, you would do a phase 1 environmental site assessment or a transaction screen. And if you'd like more information about that, you can address that in the Q&A that you submit to EEC. But basically documents to ensure that there's not an environmental factor or a contamination factor that you have to address as part of your work, like capping off contaminated soil before you build your playground.
All right, and then the question about a project in outdoor play space that's not directly on the site. So it's a playground across the street. It's used by the EEC license program, and it looks like it's a portion of a public park that they have access to. Could they apply, Teresa, sorry, it's a question for you. Could they apply to do work on that site and include it in the project that they may be proposing? But it sounds like it's not owned by them. It's a portion of a public park that they are looking at improving, perhaps.
If it's a portion of a public park and they don't have any control, I'm just trying to find the question. They don't have any control of that park, then EEOST could not be used for that. Unless they, I'm sorry, do they have ownership or a lease of that space?
So I'm wondering, I'm going to put you on the spot, Adam. If you want to come live, I can try to do that. If you can come live and just have a quick dialogue with us, or, tell us a bit more. Let's see if that works. But go ahead if you're able to. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Adam.
Good. Hi, how are you?
Good.
So if we're applying for a site, and the question was like, the main project is the site itself and the interior work. But if there's an adjacent playground, it's public park, but it's permitted access to that section of the public park, if that makes sense. I think the answer is no. I just wanted to check. So
I think the answer is no, Adam, unless Bree or Neil think differently, but it doesn't sound like you have control of site control would be the key to that space.
Unfortunately, this would not apply, Adam, since you don't own the portion of the park in question or lease it from or lease it in any way. So it's just that my understanding is you just have a permit to have certain access to it. So unfortunately, that would not be eligible.
Yeah.
thank you.
Does that help?
No problem.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Question for Bree: can a project be in two different categories? For example, playground improvements and a kitchen remodel?
Absolutely. So if you have a capital needs assessment or some other list of projects that meet the 5 areas of the grant, you can combine those projects within the application to be one project. So the example I gave, if you have a roof replacement and a bathroom remodel, you can do those 2 as long as they meet those 5 major categories.
And just to add that it has to still be all on the same site, just one site. Someone asked earlier if they could do 2 different projects at 2 different sites, but I had answered in the Q&A that has to be one site. I think that's it for the Q&A. Let's wait a few minutes. I would just encourage you all to put any other questions in the Q&A. And we'll see if we forgot anything, but please don't hesitate to ask anything at all.
May I add one more point about the environmental and hazardous materials reports? So technically, they are not, if you have not yet completed them, you can complete them. If you are awarded the funds, you can complete them after that point. There is a caveat there that once you request EEOST and you are awarded funding for that amount, if you then discover environmental or hazardous materials issues that have a cost or associated with it or will impact your timeline, unfortunately, you cannot go back and request additional funding at this time from the EEOST program to pay for it. So ideally, you will have a sense of whether those conditions exist at your site or within your building before you apply so that you can request funds to remediate those issues as part of the application. But if you do, if you are awarded funds, say for a playground project, and then complete an environmental site assessment and discover issues, you may need to fund that work on your own. So that is just a complication to consider. If it exceeds the amount of the available EEOST grant you have to go into the project, or you may need to reallocate your plans to do a play structure in order to remediate the issues at hand on the site. So I just wanted to add additional information.
Great. Any other questions? I see Christina. So let's see, Christina, if you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for holding this
Sure.
presentation. It was very helpful. My question is, are faith-based schools eligible?
So Teresa, you want to take that?
For Neil.
Oh,
So Christina, can you tell us more about a faith-based school and what your connection is in terms of whether you are a separate organization from the religious institution or you are part of?
I believe the 501s are separate. So it's a school that is curriculum-based, faith-based.
Curriculum faith-based, but it is a separate program from, is it a church or a synagogue or what?
Church, correct.
It's a church. And so you have your own 501c3, you're a separate nonprofit organization from the church?
Correct.
Okay. And you have your own audited financials from the church, separate from the church as
Correct.
well?
Mhm.
Then yes, you would be eligible to apply.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Thanks for asking.
Sure.
anyone else? Any other questions? All right, so I'll turn it back to you, Teresa, to close us out.
All right, well, thank you, everyone, for participating in this session. We hope that it was helpful. We really strongly encourage you to ask as many questions as possible, and you can do that through the email address, and you'll get, again, a copy of the slides in the next few days. But we want to answer all of your questions so that we can make sure that you're submitting applications that, you know, are successful. So good luck on your submission, and everyone have a good evening. Thanks.